Good morning. This morning, we have Dr. Emily Smith here with us, who is an assistant professor at Duke University with research interest including children's global surgery, poverty metrics, health economics, and global health policy. She's an epidemiologist who has worked with her in-country partners at the Edna Adan Hospital in Somaliland for the past 5 years on projects related to children's surgical care. Prior to this work, she worked at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She was involved in utilizing epidemiological methods, mathematical modeling techniques, and effectiveness research to determine effectiveness of various testing strategies among HIV-exposed infants in sub-Saharan Africa. So I know, and I may or may not have pronounced some of those things correctly, but here is Emily Smith.
Thank you. That really was a mouthful. So I should have taken that part out of the biography because that was my dissertation, which you always want to make as long as possible so that it feels heftier than what it probably is. Well, let me share my screen. I promise there's not 51 slides. I just throw them all in there in case I get asked a question. Thank you for having me. Like as introduced, I am Emily Smith. We've been here in Durham. Well, I got my PhD from the other blue. Don't know which one that, I guess we already said it anyway. In 2012 to 2016, I guess. And then I've been at Duke since then doing my research. I did have a stint at Baylor in Texas, and you'll hear a little bit about that story during the pandemic years, pretty much, where I was an assistant professor there. I'm married to a pastor. We've been married 21 years and have 2 kids. I just turned 16-year-old, which I'm in denial about. Who's really sweet, Bella, and then Jonathan is 13. 2 dogs, so we're just in the thick of life. So what I'll talk about today, a little bit of science and a whole lot of faith. I grew up in the church with my parents being worship leaders at a charismatic church, and my husband grew up in a Southern Baptist church. They've been Southern Baptist for decades until we left during the pandemic. But all that to say, you will hear a lot of nerdy stats that hopefully won't bore you, but it's all through the lens of faith, which hence the title, The Science of the Good Samaritan. So I just wrote my first book, which, y'all, is just an honor of a lifetime. Here's for the Zoom people to see it through Zondervan, called The Science of the Good Samaritan, Thinking Bigger About Loving Our Neighbors. And the reason I came to that, you'll hear the story of how I got the book deal, basically through the pandemic, but also just in my day job plus in faith. I think the Science of the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan, is an interesting lens just to live our life. I do want to start with a couple of disclaimers on my social location and who I am. I come as a white Christian cis female from the US who went to a lot of great schools. There's a lot of privilege in that entire statement, including straight white Christian cis female and married to a pastor. It's another one in the States. I also want to acknowledge the land that I live and work on, and also the ones that I grew up in. I grew up in a tiny town in New Mexico, so you see the traditional lands noted there. Okay, so we're going to go back. This is circa late 1980 something. This is me in kindergarten, where I had to do this project called All About Me. I mean, it's the classic of what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said I wanted to be 2 things. One was Sandy Patty. Anybody? Yes, what? Melody. Yeah. Thank you. She was, just very much mainstream Christian music. And I just loved her. I wrote her a letter when I was 11. And I still remember the paper, like the blue paper. I still haven't heard back, which is fine. And then the other was I wanted to be a missionary. We were the family who, when the missionaries came to our church to talk, I would get kicked out of my room and they would stay in my room. And I just remember probably pestering them way too much, but just about their life. I'd ask so many questions of how did you get to what you're doing? And just tell me anything about your adventures. So I thought I just wanted to be a missionary. And of course, that would be doing pre-med. I also loved science. Please admire my science fair board over there. It is not the Staples board, that the flimsy kind. I did a 3-year research project at the Texas Tech University, which was a 2.5-hour drive to get to. I mean, I was all in. God bless my parents. The town I grew up in, like I mentioned, was so small in eastern New Mexico. We didn't even have a science program. But my chemistry teacher in 10th grade, when I told him I just love DNA, because when he talked about DNA, I just fell in love. Handed me a chemistry book. Does that mean? Sorry about that. Yeah. And I read it, but he didn't tell me it was a college textbook. And then he put me in touch with the person you see on the screen is Dr. Schondorf. She was the first female PhD I had ever met and just got me hooked even more with science. But I did this science fair project. It was pre-med route. That's kind of where I was headed in life until I went on my first stint out of the US on the Mercy ships, which many of you might probably be familiar with. It is a medical mission boat where they take, they took an old cruise ship, a Norwegian cruise ship, and then refitted it to be, the bottom layer was where they could do surgeries. And then we all lived in the upper layers. I went to Honduras and I realized there that I was mainly helping in the kitchen because it's all I could do. But I would go with the doctors out into their outreaches or when the patients would come on board. And I noticed I was just automatically asking questions about why this group of people were so poor than others, why prevalence with diabetes or ringworms were so high with these kids than it was in others. I didn't know it at the time, but those are epidemiology questions. Thankfully, that helped me pivot to get a PhD instead of pre-med. So I always tell students, I work here at Duke, to ask the question of where their heart like automatically gravitates to, if it's population or if it's individual. But I also noticed something else here. I noticed that the poverty was very different than I had ever seen before. But I was also a Christian and growing up in the church and hearing these, abundance of God will provide, all these scriptures, and I wasn't seeing that tangibly. So to me, that is the epidemiology of neighboring as well. For those of you that don't know, the epidemiology is the science of epidemics, basically. What makes epidemics spread and who is more at risk. Prior to the pandemic, people thought we were skin doctors. Usually, thank you for laughing. I can always tell if it's going to be a good group or not if people laugh at that joke. But asking about moles for sure. Now people at least kind of know what we do, although there's a lot of armchair epidemiologists, I'm sure. So this is a story that most of you all are familiar with. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a story in the Bible that we all grew up in the church, where a man is on the side of the road and you see him front and center. And he's sick enough or hurt enough to not be able to help himself. 2 people walk by and you see them in the background of this picture. And do you remember who they were? Story?
Like a Jewish rabbi and else that was prominent.
Yes. Jewish rabbi and someone else that was prominent. They're 2 religious leaders of the day that certainly denote power and privilege of the day. And they walk by. By the way, this is very much, I want this to be a conversation, so feel free to interrupt at any point. But then the Samaritan stops by. And at the time, the Samaritan was who you did not expect to stop. They were certainly an outsider to the group. When Jesus is telling this story, when he would have said Samaritan, they would have perked up at, you said a who? Stop. So the Samaritan man reached down, took care of him, took him to a place to recover, which I feel like until the pandemic, I missed this part of the story. Took him to a place to recover, and then he paid for all of it. And in my work, which you're going to hear about in just a minute, every day is affected by poverty and health. So that part of the story still gets me. I think what this story teaches us a whole lot, but how do we act as global neighbors in a world right now that is set up to do quite the opposite? I think one of the issues is, and also, by the way, I have these little bookmarks or whatever you want to call them for you if you want to take one at the end. But it's this concept of, I think Jesus shows us this, and also concept of neighboring. It's not only taking care of the man's physical needs, it's and also making sure that those needs don't impoverish him and his family. Or it's doing something, handouts are fine. We go to food pantries, all of that is fine. This is not a discourse on either or, it's both and. It's an extravagant way of neighboring and giving that costs us something. So it's that question, how do we live as neighbors? This is the core of the book, in both heart and deed, in a world set up to do quite the opposite. And I would argue that we probably see that the worst this year during an election year for sure. 2 weeks, right? 2.5 weeks until we get there. So let me take you to places where I work. I'm a global health epidemiologist at the Global Health Institute here in the School of Medicine at Duke. And these pictures, the green and lush is Burundi, a gorgeous, landlocked, incredibly densely populated country in Central Africa. The one with the cave, that's Somaliland. You'll hear me talk a lot about that because that's where I've been for 8 years. And then the bottom picture, has anybody been here? Recognize what that is? Mount Kilimanjaro. If you see it over on this is Tanzania. This is at the base of Kilimanjaro, is the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center in Moshi, which is where we spend our summers. The kids and I and the husband, we all trek over there and go, and then you can climb the mountain if you want, although we haven't yet. Maybe they will. But let me take you to Somaliland, because I think these 3 places depict neighboring in a way that certainly we don't get here in Durham, nor do we hear about. And I think we can wrestle with the juxtaposition of how do you neighbor in places like this when we're here. So Somaliland is in the Horn of Africa. You might not have heard it because technically it is part of Somalia. So any of the money that the UN or the WHO gives to poverty alleviation or development within Somalia has to funnel from Mogadishu, so Black Hawk Down. If you watched that movie, that's Mogadishu. Lots of terrorism in that area. Somaliland is an independent state within the northern part of that country. It's democratic, it's peaceful, is a gorgeous land. It's also one of the poorest countries in the world. It has it is the 4th poorest country with the highest mortality and infant and child rates out of pretty much all countries. If you look at the map, the bottom bar are the mortality rates for kids and infants and moms that die in the country. One step up, the green, is Ethiopia. One step up than that is just the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. And then if you go further up, it's for the world. So compared to even neighboring Ethiopia, it's a critical place where need for neighboring is needed. So how I got there is I read a book called Half the Sky in my master's program that talked about this lady that Melody introduced, Edna Adon. If you haven't read that book or watched the documentary, it's a PBS documentary, go and watch it. She was the first female, she was married to the president. She was the first female midwife, first female in the entire country to leave and go to the UK to get a graduate degree. And she came back at 60 years old. She was at the WHO for a long time. And when she decided to retire, take out her entire pension and go back to her home country and start a hospital. They wouldn't give her land to be able to do so. The only place they would give it is the town dump. And it's dumped for trash, but it's also dumped for when they had the big civil war where the bodies were. So it is no man's land. However, it is also the place where the women who go have the most maternal complications with hemorrhaging and they need care quickly, it's really close to those. So she said, sure, I'll build a hospital. So she did. It's now about 20 years old, has a medical school in her country as well. So when I met her, this is straight out of getting my PhD. I met her at a conference. We were both speaking at it, and I went up to her only for a selfie because I was like, I've loved you for a long time. Can I have a picture? She said yes. Later on in the conference, I got the nerve up to ask her, I'm an epidemiologist. Is there anything I can do for your country? Just throw a Hail Mary. And she said, sure, we have a lot of kids that are dying. Can you help? And I said, yes, not knowing how we would actually do it. So I met a couple of pediatric surgeons here at Duke, and we started an ongoing research project on if we want to scale up care for children in the country, we have to know where they are. So what we did is we went to nearly 1,000 homes all across the country. And if we go back to the map, the Hargeisa that you see is the capital. 50% of the population lives there. Nearly all of the pediatric surgeons, or really any healthcare, is located there. If you go further east, that is Puntland area. It's a lot of nomadic communities. Our team was not able to go there because of some Al-Shabaab fears, but the hut that you see here, those are the families that live in that area. So we asked the questions of if children live there, have they had any type of health need, and did they get that need? What did your family have to do to help get that child to care? Did you have to sell anything or borrow any money? Because we kind of knew poverty was going to be an issue. But then we also asked the question, sorry about that, guys, my hair. How many of the kids actually made it to care? Because we were trying to see what the gap was of the children who needed care, who actually got to care in Hargeisa, which was, the highest level that you could get in the country. And we found there were 250,000 children who had some sort of an acute health need. And that ranged from bones that were broken or a lot of burns when they fall in the fire, all the way to a huge amount of congenital anomalies. So these are babies born with hydrocephalus, the larger brains. Basically, they need surgery very quickly. We also see a lot of anomalies we don't see here in the States. I never heard of gastroschisis. That's where the baby's bowels are born basically outside of their bodies. In the US, you depict that on antenatal care. And so you have a surgeon bedside, they're ready to go, they sew the baby up, they take care of them for a little bit, then they live a normal life the rest of their life. However, if that condition is not operated on within 3 to 4 days, it's 100% fatal, which is what we see in Somaliland, because there's no way that they can do that level of pediatric surgical care. So we saw a lot of congenital anomalies, much higher than what we see in Ethiopia. So our question from there is, well, what do we do about it? We knew from our data, doing some really fancy statistics, that the two major predictors of that gap, 250,000 kids who needed some sort of care, and only 1,200 got that care. It's a huge gap. But when you sift out the data, the biggest problems were geography. They live too far away, which makes sense when you see the topography of the area. But then the other one is poverty. And I wasn't expecting poverty to be such a mainstay. When we accounted for the income of the family, the number of kids that they had to feed, basically the holistic view of a family, the number one predictor of a family diving into poverty and never coming out was having a child with a health need. Because all of us who are parents are going to do what it takes, sell what we need to get that child care. So we are now asking the question through the data of how can we protect them from that? Do we make the surgery free? So we modeled that. It helped a little bit, but what was really impoverishing families was paying for the transportation and the food just to get to the hospital. So how do you protect millions of families in Burundi or Somaliland from that? I think it's policy. That data took about 5 to 6 years to analyze and publish. It took us to the UN, which this is still a pinch me moment. I mean, for sure, a hallmark of the career so far. And what you see here is the United Nations, and what people at the table were coming to do were to ask the question of, what if we provided universal health coverage, free health care for all? How do you define that? Is that just immunizations and bed nets for malaria? Is it COVID vaccines plus Tamiflu or anything else? What we were there to say, when you are talking about universal health coverage, we have to talk about children who with cancer or surgical needs, which is what our data showed, but also the pre-care. So it's not just healthcare, it's making sure food and lodging is available. I mean, almost like a world Uber to get them really to care, which is not unseen, I think, to do it. So that is my day job. I need to pivot, and this is a hard pivot because I don't know how to transition to this one, but it'll make sense at the end. So I'm doing this work, and then COVID hits in 2020. Now, I'm an epidemiologist, so we follow this all the time. Ebola happens, and we get the alerts from the CDC. Well, most of us follow it. So when we started hearing about this thing in Wuhan, a lot of us perked up more than Ebola, because Ebola is terrible, but it is not 90% fatal. It is in places where they don't have good health care. It's also not super duper infectious unless you have bad sanitation, which is why it was so bad in Sierra Leone. But when someone is sick with Ebola, you know that they are sick. It looked like with whatever this was happening in Wuhan, people were going to be sick prior to them actually knowing they were sick, which that's a huge uh-oh for us, because it means they're going to travel around and infect people prior to them even knowing. So I started a Facebook page because we were hearing a lot about flatten the curve, and my real life neighbors, my mom, basically was asking, what does flatten the curve mean? And then my kids, because they were little at the time, their friends were asking, how long are we going to be out of school? So I started this Facebook page. I named it Friendly because I tend to be too friendly. If I say by you on a plane, I'm really sorry. But neighbor, because of the Good Samaritan story, because I knew something like this was going to make us be neighbors, hopefully, to one another, but it would also make us neighbor nations. Because if it looked like it was going to spread as fast and as crazy as it did in Wuhan, it was going to hit the US. I mean, we just saw what it was about to happen, and it unfortunately did it. But then what about Somaliland, who is not equipped at all, or Burundi to take care? There's no ICU. So I named it that, hoping that the Good Samaritan story would spur people to act accordingly. As we all saw with the pandemic becoming political, we were in Texas at the time. My husband was a pastor at a mega church there. We were in Waco, Texas, so the heart of the Bible Belt. And we started seeing it get political, but then also faith. Y'all saw it too. You know, we're not going to wear a mask out of faith. And I was thinking, wait a minute, it's not scripture, but it's certainly not science. And so I would write posts about it, and it would go semi-viral. I mean, I was doing them daily. I did about 500 posts daily, so I wasn't seeing the growth as much. I just wasn't paying attention to it. And then when it became political, we all saw that too. I started writing about that. And George Floyd was murdered. I wrote how that's an equity issue for a lot of people who had never heard about that being an equity issue before. Why does Black Lives Matter? How is that different than all lives matter? And why it matters to know the difference. But also on a global stage, when it started going and it would hit India, I'd say that's an equity issue too. The Capitol riot happened. I wrote a post. That was the one post that I did not sleep on. Because usually I'd write something and then get up in the morning and probably tone it down a little. That one I didn't. But and I think it's okay to be angry at those times and let it go. So it grew to about 110,000 people, which are still holding, with a reach of 10 million in 80 countries, which is just mind-boggling to me. And what an honor. I did a survey to see who these people are. 50-50 are people of faith, a lot of evangelicals for sure, but a lot of just various faith. And then 50% of no faith, but really wanted the science or wanted to know how to neighbor. And I was on NPR and the Washington Post and Time Magazine. I mean, this issue of neighboring globally and neighboring well to the pandemic, you all saw, became a hot topic button. And for some reason, what I was saying, people were listening, kind of. And I think it's because of this story. I anchored it in a way of, guys, if we don't put our mask on, we're walking by and we're just as bad as this power and privilege. It's a privilege to not wear a mask, basically, or worry about it even globally, or get a vaccine. Or, I mean, it was all couched within the Good Samaritan story, which most people were familiar with. But it's also not just a Christian faith issue. I have this on the back of the card that I have. I started noticing, and Facebook actually asked me to do this almost like a series of faith and science during the pandemic, and how I told them I will do it as long as it's not just Christian, because it's not just a Christian issue on being a good neighbor. And so we had Muslim leaders that would come on. Certainly we had Russell Moore on the evangelical side, Walter Kin, the National Evangelical Association. We had a Hindu leader come on. But then, and what you see are love your neighbor as yourself, cemented in pretty much all of the major religions in the world. And then at the very bottom is love your neighbor. That's just being a good human. That was my little Jonathan at age 9 that said that, because once I started being a little bit more bolder in my post on this is an equity issue and it has to be political, but I don't mean for it to be, we started receiving some significant threats, including at the house. And my Jonathan could not understand why. It's just loving, it's just being a good human, which I would say, yes, that's true, buddy. So I want to end with a little bit about what the book is, maybe some lessons learned from that Facebook page, which remains ongoing, but also how to translate that when we're certainly not post-pandemic, but we're post the super scary part, because we do have vaccines and kind of treatments, although I certainly wish they'd be better. But when people started asking me, that evangelical group that I had, the 50,000 on the site, I saw them split pretty significantly with not much middle ground. And some were just, we are going as hardcore as possible to the MAGA side. And then there was this other group that said, I've never heard someone talk about equity like this and why it's a faith issue, and I want to know more. But they would email, one lady said, but I don't want to be a crazy liberal. I was like, that's okay. I grew up in the church. I understand what that means. But there's this group, and I think still exists, who want to be good neighbors in whatever church that they're in, but don't know how. And I would argue the first step to doing that is centering. I'm a history nerd, so in the book, I go through a lot of history on why I think knowing history matters, especially to us white Christians in the US. Does anyone know this picture? I didn't know what it was until graduate school, but you can see it's a horseshoe table. There are 14 high income leaders, which at the time were all white male. Do you see the map at the back of the room? It's the map of the African continent. So this is the Great Scramble. It's where the 14 high income or leaders of the world basically came together in Berlin. And the point of it was to try to modernize the continent, or evangelicalize the continent for sure. And so at the end of this meeting, 90% of the continent would be colonized by those 14 countries. And the problem, there's a lot of problems with that, but when you look at the geography prior to the Great Scramble in 1880, these are the natural, organic people groups of the continent. By after that, the people groups would be split up by as high as 30%. And the countries that were split in half, if you look at Lake Victoria, it looks like someone literally just drew a line straight through it at that meeting, which they might have. Somaliland is another, the same. That's why it was cut into 2 territories. Italy colonized the bottom portion of Somalia in a pretty horrific way on building arms, certain just really harsh colonization. Britain went to Somaliland, and it was not the best colonization because none of it is good, but they built a lot of hospitals and a lot of education systems. They had a certain different mentality. But the countries that were split in half by the Great Scramble, if you go forward to this day, that's Burundi and Somaliland. It's the countries with the highest rates of genocide and poverty and children's health disparities. But we see it here in the States too. If you don't know who Father Gustavo Gutierrez is, he is the grandfather of liberation theology. He just passed away last week, actually, at 93 or 96 in Peru. But I love what he says here about the need to know history. The poor person does not exist as a fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral. It's not ethically innocent. They're a byproduct of the system in which they live, for which we are responsible in. And we all know that history in the US as well. But I want to talk about one specific story. Are y'all familiar with this painting? This, who you see on the table is a woman named Lucy. She was certainly enslaved, and who you see looking at her are the doctors, but the main doctor is Dr. Marion Sims. If you know that name, it's because he is the grandfather of modern day OBGYN work. New York has a school of medicine named after him. He also developed the speculum for us women, the Sims speculum, that when we go and have our yearly exam, the speculum is called Sims after him. It's named after him though, because what he developed on these women that you see here without anesthesia is fistula care. So a lot of women that would go into childbirth, you see this here in the world, in Somaliland a lot. If it would rip and there was not any type of medical care, when the baby was coming out, then the urine basically would leak all the time. It's a horrific problem. And he was trying to fix that. So he used enslaved women to do it without anesthesia. He would go on to perform this on white women after he won a lot of awards with anesthesia. I bring these three women up. It's Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, because they're the only three women out of 40 to 50 that were named in his journals about him trying to perfect his trade. There's a movement now to rename the speculum the Lucy after her instead. I bring him up because if you go to New York Central Park, there used to be a statue for him right on the outskirts of Central Park that's since been taken down. And they have a plaque now for Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha, and all the other women that were unnamed here. But if you go to Alabama, which is where he was, the statue of him in the state capitol still stands. So you have to ask the question of, what do you do there? We saw that here at Duke too, as well, with statues and monuments. But I think we have to reckon with this, especially on teaching my children who are very white, why it matters to know the correct history. Here's the statue that you see that's been taken down at Central Park. If you go to Alabama, about a mile down the road from the state capitol, this woman built the three statues that you see here for Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. You can see on Lucy, her abdomen is ripped out and it's made into a crown of speculums. It's a really powerful image telling the history correct. That same woman would go and re-depict that painting that we just saw on the street in Alabama. Very powerful. I think the other thing that we have to center ourselves, not just history, is knowing what structural violence is. Because we certainly know that throwing punches are not good, but what about structures that impose violence? So when my Jonathan was, I was 8 months pregnant and just started seeing stars, which I knew were probably not normal in pregnancy, I called my doctor and she said, you need to come in, let's check your blood pressure. And indeed it was preeclampsia, and real quick, had to have him. It was very scary. Post that, I had the post-eclampsia, which both of us were in the hospital multiple times with, stroke. Like, it was really, really scary. When you go to Somaliland though, and if there's another woman who has that type of condition, there's no place, there's no preeclampsia interventions or stroke care to help her or the baby. That is a form, I think, of structural violence. It's violence imposed by structures or policies or power or perhaps geography. If you look in Burundi, Burundi is another country like Somaliland, but it's a little different because it's not deserty. It's more like you can see rolling hills, and this borders up to Rwanda. So there's a lot of the conflict, still remaining conflict in the genocide in this area as well. But we're looking at the women who come with preeclamptic or maternal conditions prior to giving birth. And those women most of the time have an average walking of 6 hours just to get to care when you're 8 months pregnant or 9 months pregnant and hemorrhaging. That's structural violence. So when I started talking about those type of issues on the Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist, these are what started popping up in our mailbox. This is the first one we got in our mailbox, which was threat. And I'm not showing you all of it. It would start a series of threats, either against myself for mainly my children. The hard part was 90% of those threats came from people within the church. And half of those were people that we knew, that we went to school with or we went to church with. So I don't show this to be whatever the word is, like a shock factor. I show it as these, if you are going to be a neighbor and center, especially through a faith point in the US, it's going to cost something. And now I can say we're kind of okay with the cost. Although it took us we both had to quit our jobs. He quit his job. My husband did in the church because it just got untenable, you can imagine. And then we just moved. We just made a big move to come back to Duke. My parents are here too, but the kids having to be, at home and not know why, or to have safe homes if they go walking in the neighborhood by themselves just in case something happened, that does something to you, I think. And so what it did to me is my body finally just said no more. And I got extremely sick with a migraine that didn't let up for about 15 months. And thankfully, I'm just beyond grateful to be able to stand here and play games and laugh, because it was so costly. And I don't think that that's necessarily the mark of faithfulness, is how costly it is. But I tell my kids all the time, it takes courage and cost if you want to act like a neighbor in today's world. And this is our story of what it was for sure. And I'm going to end with the good part of it does take courage to do this. And how do you find that? As a policy person and in my work, I do it by saying we need to flip the script on trickle-down economics, and let's start with the bottom and move up. Because the data supports it too, regardless of how you splice the data. If you invest in the bottom poor globally and nationally, there's a massive trickle up effect, almost a 14-to-1 return of investment. That was super nerdy for a Sunday morning, but there's the data for that for sure. We're looking into this within conflict zones with children with cancer. So I'm working with St. Jude on scooping those kids out of Gaza or Ukraine or Burundi, because they're not only the impacts, we know it's going to make an impact on them, but the neighboring countries is pretty bad. The flip side of that is if we invest there first, it's a 14-to-1 ROI. So why not flip the script? And the second was, how do we measure the worth of a life? So this picture is from the New York Times. It's during the Ebola crisis that happened in the 2013, 2014 era in West Africa that, all of us remember. It's horrific. Ebola, like I mentioned, is not deadly. It is if you're in a place that does not have the capacity to care for it. The picture that you see here is he's the Dr. Fauci of West Africa. If you live in that part of the country, really throughout Africa, you know who he is. Prior to the Ebola outbreak, he had been lobbying the US government, DOD, with hallmark people like Paul Farmer, Dr. Fauci, major global health players, saying if something like Ebola hits my community and those like it, it's going to dismantle everything pretty much. And so they gave him enough money to build a couple of walls, infrastructure a little bit, but then it hit, and it hit hard, because something like Ebola, you have to have good contamination, sanitation. You all know that. He also got infected though, pretty early on in the epidemic, and he got really sick really fast, like what one does. In a neighboring country, they were able to fly him to a WHO center that had what was at the time a drug. It was the only vaccine or antidote. Is very much experimental. It's called ZMapp, which if you've heard of it, it's because it's used now in Ebola outbreaks. The problem was, in the world, there were only 3 or 4 vials of this, one of which was at that WHO, I'm sorry, not WHO, the MSF, Doctors Without Borders Center. So they had to make these discussions of, do we give him an experimental ZMapp that may or may not work? If you look at the New York Times article, it goes into I'm sure what were really fraught conversations of how to decide that, but it was decided not to give him that. A couple of weeks later, he ended up passing away from Ebola with none of his family there. And finally, at the end, they let a friend go in, basically, and just to be with him as he died. The other picture that you see, I remember seeing this play out on the news. Some of you also might have if you followed it, but it is Dr. Kent Brantley, if you know that name. He was also in West Africa, in Sierra Leone at the time, through Samaritan's Purse. He got sick along with one of the nurses in the country. He got medevaced out to Nebraska and Atlanta, where they had the state of the art, had the stations. I mean, he ended up getting ZMAP here. And so the question for me is going up 30,000 foot and asking, how do we value a life through a good neighbor? Who's worthy or not to get ZMAP? I have good friends who work with Samaritan's Purse, so I'm not degrading that for sure. Franklin Graham was the only person I named in my book called out by name. So I've got qualms with how he works. But I don't think it's an issue of are missionaries good? I think it's an issue of who gets what and who makes those decisions. Both were asked to be medevaced, but only one was given a medevac because the plane wasn't available for the other doctor. So when I tell this story in my classes, this always what typically makes everybody mad, which is kind of the point. But it's also, you see them make that shift of who's worthy to get it, and then bringing it to my work, who or what country is worthy of getting certain children's health care, gastroschisis care, immunizations or vaccines, where 90% of the global vaccine market was gobbled up by the US during the height of the pandemic. Which brings me to this picture. Y'all might know or remember this picture again. It's in New York Times, but it's in India. Do you remember when their outbreak happened? They maxed out at 400,000 cases in a day, and that would go on for 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, the country, bless it, was just pounded with COVID because it is densely populated, but they also didn't have the capacity yet, and we have to ask questions why, to be able to take care of these patients. The chapter of the book that I write about this is when they ran out of oxygen. One of the hospital systems, the most capacity one within the main area of this picture of India, quite literally they would run out of oxygen. So families were just going out and buying oxygen tanks wherever they could find it, which after a couple of days, they were all gone, and bringing it in. And one hospital in Jaipur talked about they had 26 ICU patients, and in one night, 24 had died simply because they lost oxygen. So as a good neighbor in the Good Samaritan story, we have to ask the question, why? Why historically there wasn't oxygen there in the first place, but there was for us here? I think through the scriptures, if you look at the Good Samaritan story, I'm going to end with just a couple of bringing us back to faith. One is this issue of accompaniment. And I love how Pope Francis talks about it. It teaches us to take off our shoes because the ground where the poor is holy. I will likely cry on this part, so I will prepare everybody because I just love this story. So what if we went where Ebola was, or Children's Health Aspect, or these places where the poor are, and we took off our shoes in a posture, our countries took off the shoes in a posture of humility and of also respect. When I was in Honduras on the Mercy Ship, like I told you about, one of the first families that we went to, the father had died weeks ago of HIV, and he was still laying in the house because they couldn't afford a casket. So we pulled our money and got him a casket. It was a wood casket, $20, $30. But I do remember the leader of that group, because I'm 19 years old, just completely freaked out by it all. And he, with such dignity, approached the family with humility. Like he had a posture of taking off his shoes to them, not only buying the coffin, but doing the burial in this incredibly beautiful way in the poorest part of Honduras. I think that's humility, but I also think it's Jesus, right? I just think Jesus would have done it too. I'm going to end with this. I think, I used to tell my students, maybe because I'm a woman in science, that there are only so many people or so many spaces at a table. And that's kind of true in today's society. If you go to the UN at the very front of that, you might have seen it. There is a huge table there with 6 spots. Most of the time, they're only men that are filled there. The past 2 times I've been, or 3 times I've been at the UN, there's been one woman who has come up just to say her piece, and then she goes back and sits back down. And I always take a picture and send it to my female students, like she's taken up her space, but then she goes and sits back down. So I used to say there's only so many seats at the table to go around. But I've changed that now to say I think Jesus shows us a new table where there is enough for all. I think neighboring interrupts us and asks us to that table just like Jesus does. And he models this for us. If you think of that gorgeous story in the Bible where everybody's at that massive picnic and they're all hungry. He doesn't send them home. He creates a new table by taking what people have, the fish and the loaves story, and then he multiplies it. And to me, oh, I made it through until this last 5 minutes. Sorry, guys. To me, that's a new table. It is taking what we have, and it's letting God multiply to where it redefines a new table, where at the center of the table is everybody, but at the head are the poor. What if we started there? We see that in scripture too, right? Where he tells us, you set a seat for the poor, for the homeless that are in your midst. You take care and you entertain angels when you do that. You see David talk about the new table also in the Psalms, where I set a table. Remember where he sets it? In the midst of my enemies. Like that is a powerful depiction of not scarcity, but to me, it's an abundant way of viewing serving the poor, perhaps in conflict zones too. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to end on that and not share if we have time, I'm going to do the Sandlot story, but I want to leave enough time for questions or comments for sure.
When you talked about the table, and I can't remember the exact reference of this, but I think about in the New Testament when they're told, Jesus tells them to go out. It's a parable of telling people to go out and
Yeah.
invite people to dinner, to the table. No one comes, and then that last minute they go out and just find, the homeless, the poor,
Yes.
that all come in. But it reminds me of that because they were the people who received and accepted,
Yeah.
and that table was for them as
Yeah.
well.
I love, yes. And then when you see in Acts, you see the end also part of that story too, because not only is the church fed because they're pulling everything and sharing, but it said they lack nothing. And the word they there, it means all of us in the church, but then everybody else on the outside. I mean, there's an abundance of that. I love that story.
I wonder if you can point us toward or give a quick summary of any organization or country that's applied your insights about making universal health care really affordable, the food, lodging part. Is
Yeah.
anybody taking up that challenge?
Well, and I feel like I'm in a good space where I'm not going to get kicked out. If I would answer this question in Texas, I feel like I'd get kicked out of the church.
You won't get kicked out.
That's right. We're in a good space. But we see that in some Norwegian or European countries where they have had universal health coverage for years. They also have the lowest numbers of maternal and child mortality, pretty much any type of health or chronic condition in the world. So I think we have a good roadmap of where this is already occurring. I think to put universal health coverage in a country like the US, where it's just, I mean, that's just going to be a huge uphill battle. It's going to take a lot of lobbying, I think, and policy to get there.
In terms of anybody, even are there organizations that make the travel and meal expense
Yeah.
for people in African countries, for example?
Yeah, I love that question. So St. Jude, my partner for the children's cancer, does just that, where if you can get to a facility that St. Jude has their chemotherapy or radiation in, then the lodging and the food is free. What we're trying to do now, we were just in New York to ask for $18 million at the Clinton Global Initiative, was to help families pay for what they had to pay for pre to get there. So it's basically, it's offsetting any of those other burdens through just a cash transfer. Give them $1,000 and let it not bankrupt the family. So I think we're getting close. It's just not going to be policy. It's going to be more scrappy people doing that. But St. Jude is definitely leading the way. Doug, do you have one?
I'm the typical mic runner for the class.
Oh, are you? Oh,
Oh, you
okay.
have to grab the.
But you might have a question also.
I'm still, my mind's blown, so just thank you.
Oh, no.
I have 1,000 questions. I can't
Well, I
verbalize
might
any.
have one answer
yeah.
on those, so we'll see.
But nothing specific, just extremely insightful, and now I know why I'm a leader husband. Speaking so much of the work that you're doing, and why I have to become familiar with you, this as the model for the church, and you and your husband as a pastor. It's just so needed. So just thank you. Whatever we can do to help as a church community. And wow, yeah.
Yeah.
So any questions I have is just in that frame, like, wow, this is so needed and so beautiful, true and good, and yet not well received. So that's the
Yeah.
question. I mean,
Yeah, I would say don't give up on give up on, there is a wisdom, which is the Sandalot story. There's wisdom to know what rooms to walk out of and places that are unsafe, and conversations or Thanksgiving tables just to get out of there. And I think, for me, that's just a boundary, but I do think that there is opportunities for some space of the Christians that we see on, TV. There are a pocket of them that want to be different, but they've never seen how. So I do think there's still room for growth, but a whole lot of wisdom for us to know where that is.
My question is just a little bit more simple. What are some practical things that at your dinner table that
Yeah.
you're doing with your children? Because that's something that's always on our mind, particularly during this season. But obviously, we want to put that in their heart and keep that for a lifetime. So just
Yes.
some practical things that you're doing.
I have an appendix in the book, one on my favorite books, because I'm just a nerdy reader, if you're interested. But the other one is that exact question. How do we do this at the dinner table? So what we did, especially when the kids were younger, when the Olympics would come on, those were, we got little paper plates and we colored them the Olympic rings, and we made cookies, and they did a scavenger hunt where, each room was a continent, and it did not, this is not Pinterest pretty, but it's just, I just printed off stuff like coloring pages. When they got bigger, we always had a map on the fridge. And so when I would come home and I'd say, hey guys, I met somebody from Romania, let's go look where that is. So they're just in tune to geography, but they also hear me talk about a friend in Romania instead of the poor in Somaliland. Or I've got Edna, like when we would Zoom, my kids would be there with me. So I think familiarizing them with that. The other thing to do is to get a Post-it note and just have it handy all the time. So if the kids are learning about anything at school and they come home talking about history, then try to do a sneak attack of, wow, have you heard of the Great Scramble? Let me show you a picture. And a sticky note, you can write the Great Scramble and put it on the map, or just, something which redirects them. But I think those are the biggest, raising little global neighbors. Once they get older, I do a lot of role play with my kids. Because when Bella was little, this is elementary school, she was at the lunch table and someone was talking about immigrants incredibly poorly. And being sweet little Bella, she spoke up and said, actually, my mom says, this about people in the world. And they came after her and attacked her. So she put her head on the table, got really upset. So we role played that at home of how do you answer that, where you can't punch, but you can't cry either. And so how do you say that? And part of that option is leaving the table. Love that question though.
And you referenced, in Acts, it's one of the first Christian communities when they took care of everyone.
Yeah.
No one was in need, no one had too much, but everybody had, exactly what they needed. We studied that a couple of summers ago. And I remember that hitting me then, because that's that is a Christian perspective of taking care of your neighbor. And you see it at times, but unfortunately you don't see it as much as we should.
Right.
And I wish that more would realize that that is the true nature that we should have.
Right, yes. Or when I would write a post about Galatians 5, that, sentiment, it's really hard to come back, for them to have a comeback about those scriptures, especially from the church. I think this is what Jesus meant with extravagant giving of Good Samaritan or Acts or the Galatians scripture. So I would say keep using scripture to help. And I don't know, you'll see the people who will listen and then the ones that don't, we just move on. At least I do.
It's about time. Does anybody else have a question? Before we thank her, well, we always like to show our appreciation in the classroom and online, so you'll see.
I see everybody. Thank you.
So thank you so much for coming. Next week, we have Henry Perry, who is a congregation member, and he'll be speaking about a personal journey of bridging faith and learning in global health.
Oh,
So,
nice.
similar things.
Yeah, you gotta think.
So thank you again.
Thank you.
I always like to remind people in the Old Testament that it said the year of the Jubilee. And I'm going,